That will be seen as a model by the nuclear industries in countries like France, Czech Republic, Poland, Finland. So there are more, it's not just about Britain, the nuclear program here. So what were the promises? Well, the promises were basically about competition and competitiveness. The promise was that there will be 2 or 3 different companies building nuclear power plants, so we would be able to see who the best one at it was. There would be competition between different types of nuclear power plants, so again, we would be able to choose which was the cheapest, most cost-effective of them. We were told that nuclear power would be competitive with gas, and the assumption here, and I'll come back to this assumption so don't worry too much about the numbers, was that we could build one of these plants for about £1,250 per kilowatt. I remember a nuclear power station is something like 1 million kilowatts, so £1,250 a kilowatt means about £1.8 billion for something like the European pressurised water reactor that is proposed for nuclear. And also we would need a carbon price, a price on the European trading system for carbon of about €36 per tonne. Again, I'll come back to those figures later, so don't worry too much about them. And we were told that the first power would come in 2017, and Vincent de Rivas said we'd be able to cook our turkeys at Christmas using power from Hinkley. Turkeys and EPRs, interesting juxtaposition. But of course the main promise was no subsidies. Malcolm Wicks in front of the Select Committee was asked if he'd be prepared to consider guarantees, for example, cap on the nuclear waste costs, guaranteeing the price of the energy produced from nuclear, and Malcolm Wicks said, I would be very surprised if we issued that sort of guarantee. So what's the present position? Well, we set up 3 consortia to build plants, but 2 of them are effectively dormant or out of the game in the long term. We're left with NNB Genco, which is the vehicle that EDF set up to build Hinkley, which had Centrica, or British Gas, as its partner, a 20% partner. Centrica pulled out last month. So we don't have any competition on different builders. Different designs, we started looking at 4 different designs, and we were going to go through a very comprehensive review of those designs, taking about 5 years, so that it would be possible to build all of those. We started with 4, we've got 1 now, which is the French European pressurised water reactor. The construction cost, expected to be £12.50 per kilowatt, is now estimated at about £4,400 a kilowatt. So the estimated cost of building the plant has gone up by about 3.5-fold in only 5 years. And remember that the cost of building the plant is much the largest element in the cost of a kilowatt hour of nuclear electricity. First power, well, we have the familiar phenomenon that nuclear schedules go back at the same rate as time itself. So 6 years on, we're 6 years further away from completion. And 2023 is probably the earliest we could get power from any nuclear power plant in Britain. So we're in a very different position to where we started. What is the current policy? Well, the first thing to say, it's nothing to do with changes in government. You can't distinguish between the Blair government, the Brown government and the Cameron government. They are all identical in terms of their policy. Chris Hume expressed the policy to Parliament in October 2010 in a masterpiece of doublespeak. I should like to take the opportunity to reconfirm the government's policy. There will be no public subsidy for nuclear power. Clear enough. To be clear, this means there will be no levy, direct payment or market support for electricity supply or capacity provided by a private sector new operator, unless similar support is also made available more widely to other types of generation. Now, if you can think of a form of subsidy that is not eligible under that definition, then you're doing better than I am. When did the policy change? Well, it changed just before the end of the Brown government, when the Secretary of State for Energy, which was then Ed Miliband, said basically we weren't going to get enough low carbon investment if we stuck with our free market electricity model. And a day later, the electricity regulator, Ofgem, said that if we didn't get rid of the old free market model, the lights would probably go out. And the result of that was a process that lasted for about 2.5 years and culminated in the energy bill that was published in November of last year. And the two main elements were that were a carbon price floor. In other words, whatever the carbon price on the European market was, the British government would ensure that it stayed above this floor price. And that floor price starts this year at about 16 euros per tonne and goes up to 2020 to 36 euros per tonne. And if you think that figure of 36 euros per tonne is familiar, it's because that was the level the government said nuclear would be competitive with gas at. The more important element was the introduction of new long-term contracts, feed-in tariff with contracts for difference. Now I could explain what a contracts for difference is. It's not very complicated, but essentially it means that the price you're paid for electricity is set by a contract. It's a fixed price plus escalators. And the differences just reconciles that with the free market price. And that's where we're standing today. That's what the negotiations are about, what the terms of that contract for difference will be. And the press reports of the negotiations are talking about a strike price of £100 per megawatt hour, 10 pence per kilowatt hour. That's the wholesale price. Now, for reference, the current wholesale price is about £50 a megawatt hour, and 10 years ago it was about £15 a megawatt hour. So it's substantially over the market price. There's talk of contract lengths of 40 to 50 years. There's talk about loan guarantees from government, and there's talk about passing through any cost and construction delays through to consumers. And the reason that is crucial is because banks will lend money for this project, and they will look at experience in France, where a project that should have cost 3.2 billion euros is now expected to cost 8.5 billion euros, was expected to take 5 years, is going to take at least 9 years. And they will be looking and thinking, if we lend money and the EDF has to bear that extra cost, then we're in trouble to get our money back. So we want to see a clause in the contract that says, whatever it costs to build, you can recover from consumers. So what do we learn from that? Well, this is a negotiation. The information that's going into the press comes from the two parties to the negotiation. And they have an incentive to claim that they've dragged the negotiations back from the brink, and they've wrung the hardest possible terms out of each other. So you can expect that maybe 40 to 50 years contract, it'll be perhaps 35 years. And we're supposed to be grateful for that. That perhaps instead of £140 a megawatt hour, which is where we started, we've come down to £100 a megawatt hour. So be very careful about what's reported in the press. If there is an agreement, then the first thing that will happen after that is that that contract will have to go to the European Commission, because it's undoubtedly state aid, and under European Commission law, unfair state aid is illegal. So the European Commission will have to determine whether that state aid is unfair or not. An unfair state aid is aid that distorts markets. So this is a very complicated thing to determine, and it might take 2 or 3 years. So if there is agreement, it goes on to the European Commission. If it it passes the European Commission, it comes back to us, and of course EDF said, well, sorry, the price has changed since we negotiated that, the cost of borrowing has changed, so we need to renegotiate again. And of course EDF already has the British government over a barrel. They have another chance to turn the screw on the British government. So construction might start in 2016, 2017, so your turkey is cooked maybe in 2023. Or is it your goose that we cook? And what does that mean for renewables? Well, under the energy bill, there was a new organisation set up to provide contracts for low carbon electricity. And that started with a budget of about £2 billion this year, rising to £7.6 billion in 2020. There were no budget projections beyond that. And that budget rises because the budget is cumulative. So every time you sign a contract, it's in every subsequent year. So the contract has to keep going up to add new contracts in. Now if you look at the value of a contract for a nuclear reactor of the size of one of the reactors at Hinkley, it would be in the order of about £0.8, £0.7 billion. So if we went for the 4 reactors at Hinkley and at Sizewell, that would probably consume all the budget of this new agency from 2020 for the next 4 years. So nuclear renewables would be fine up to 2020, then all the budget would be eaten by nuclear power. Who ate all the pies? Nuclear power. Will we know the terms of these contracts for differences? And again, Ed Davey was very clear. Under the Energy Bill, all investment contracts must be published and laid before Parliament, so that's all right. Oh no. Mr. Hayes says, it's possible that some contracts may contain detailed financial information belonging to a generator that falls into confidential, commercially confidential terms. In other words, we can know everything about the contract except the bits that we need to know about. How am I doing? Probably running out. So there is an assumption that EDF wants to go ahead with this, that EDF is desperate to go ahead with this reactor. And I think you have to be quite careful with that assumption. EDF is 85% owned by the French government. Arriva, the French reactor vendor, is 92% owned by the French government. So it's not EDF that's driving this train, it's the French government. And EDF does not have, is not politically able to say, we don't want to go ahead with this. I mean, I don't think it's very impressed with the EPR. The EPR has made a fool of it, Flamanville, costing 8.5 billion euros when it should have cost 3.2 billion. So I think EDF knows that the EPR is a bad and failing technology. EDF has massive debts, and it's losing its credit rating because of those debts, and it has huge investment requirements for its main market, France. So it really does not need to take a risky punt in the UK. So don't assume that EDF wants to go ahead. Of course it will, and if it wants to, if it doesn't like the terms, then it will have no problem pulling out. An investment of £28 billion for 4 reactors, it's not going to think twice about writing off £500 million in the preparation money it's spent for the reactors it wants to build. So finally, what are the implications for Fukushima? And the answer is actually very little. For the existing plants, there's really not a lot you can do to retrofit them. You can add a few things on, but the basic design is set when you start building it. So if you're not going to shut it down, basically it's going to stay, and the stress tests that we carried out apparently found no particular flaws with the British plants. The oldest plants are not now expected to go offline until 2023. Again, an interesting date, which is, and most will go on after 2030. This is interesting because 10 years ago we were told there was no certainty that the AGRs would be able to go on beyond 2010. So I think the regulator has some explaining to do why it's now possible to give them an extra 20-year life. As for the new reactors, well, the generic design assessment process, the process where the regulator looked at the safety case for the reactors in great detail, was closed very hurriedly. And again, the ONR, the Office of Nuclear Regulation, has a bit of explaining to do there. Because in September, it said there were 4 issues on instrumentation and control, which there was no possibility could be resolved in the timescale required. Yet by December, they had all been resolved. So I think there's a certain amount of magic there that needs to be explained by the Office of Nuclear Regulation. So, the final thing is to reinforce Jonathan's point about opportunity costs. We've been going with this program for 7 years. We'll go on for another 2 years maybe, and at the end of that, if all goes well for the nuclear industry, we will build 1 or 2 plants before the financial weight of it pulls it down. So for another 10 years, we will have gone on believing that nuclear can solve our problems, as Paul said it can't, and we'll find out eventually that it can't solve our problems, and there will be 10 years where we haven't pursued renewables and we haven't pursued energy efficiency, the options that really could deal with